I picked out the perfect Mother's Day gift for my stepmom, then watched her expression change when she understood what it really said. I'm Samantha, 17 years old, currently dual enrolled in online college courses and quietly preparing to take over Company A, the firm my mother built, the firm my father tried to steal, and the firm Elaine believed she had full control over since marrying into my life 5 years ago. The moment she unwrapped the book, I watched her blink twice before lifting the cover, clearly expecting a scrapbook of sentimental photos or maybe a handwritten poem, because that's what she would have done in my place if she actually cared about anyone besides herself. I told her it was personal and meant for her eyes only, then stood back as she flipped through the first few pages, still smiling, still performing like she always did, even when she didn't understand the script yet. I waited until she reached the first printed screenshot, a hotel receipt under her alias from 3 years ago, annotated in red ink with a line that said, "Dinner with tea while Mom was home with migraines." She looked up sharply, eyes searching mine for a cue to laugh, dismiss, deny, but I said nothing, just nodded slowly and told her to keep reading because there was more, and it was all in order. She turned the pages faster now, and I watched her face twitch when she reached the text messages, the ones I had printed out in exact sequence, with timestamps and call logs and references to me that made her skin pale mid-breath. "This is a joke," she whispered, almost too low to hear, but I responded clearly, telling her it wasn't, and that the rest of the party would begin in 20 minutes, so she should probably decide how she wanted to play it. "I don't understand what you want from me," she muttered, fingers trembling as she closed the book halfway, then opened it again because denial wasn't strong enough to stop her from needing to see how far it all went. I told her we'd talk after the guests left, and that it was in her best interest to smile today, toast to motherhood, and avoid causing a scene she couldn't clean up. She said I was cruel, but I said I was prepared, which she'd never been. While she pulled herself together in front of the mirror, I texted my father a reminder to be home by 4 and left the second book in his office, the one that outlined his part in the fraud, the shell transfers, and the falsified reports that he'd signed without bothering to hide the evidence. As guests arrived and the music started, I smiled at every single one of them, offered drinks, and stood beside Elaine as she toasted her beautiful family, all while knowing she couldn't remember which year I got braces or what school I actually planned to attend. When she introduced me to one of her lawyer friends as her miracle girl, I asked if he did prenups, and he laughed without knowing why Elaine stopped breathing beside him. At one point during the party, she pulled me aside and asked if I was trying to ruin her reputation, and I told her that if I wanted that, I'd have scheduled the press release for this morning instead of waiting for her to open her own mouth first. She asked me again what I wanted, this time with a sharper edge, but I told her that depended entirely on how well she could follow instructions and whether she could show up tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock to a meeting that would determine whether she walked away or got dragged. "Dragged by who?" she asked, tone mocking but eyes darting toward the corner where my phone sat on the table near the live photographer she'd hired. "Dragged by people who care about stolen legacies and misappropriated funds," I said, holding her gaze until she blinked again and turned away. The rest of the party passed with her locked in an endless loop of fake laughs and tight-lipped nods, and me making sure she heard every compliment guests gave me for my resilience and grace, words she had taught them to say, without knowing what they meant. When the party ended, she disappeared upstairs, and I found her 20 minutes later sitting on the edge of her bed, holding the book again, flipping back to the page with the forensic accountant certification of the traced transfers. "You're bluffing," she said, voice flat but desperate. I said nothing, then showed her the final page with the meeting location and the 3 signatures from my mother's former legal team, now acting under my authority. She dropped the book and stood, walking to the closet, asking me what kind of child plans something like this for Mother's Day. "The kind who doesn't forget what her mother died protecting," I said, then walked out of the room as she cursed under her breath. Before I went to bed, I called the retired judge from my mother's legal network and confirmed he'd be ready at 9 o'clock with everything we'd prepared, including the document that would strip Elaine and my father of decision-making power without giving them grounds to contest. He asked if I was certain I wanted to do this before turning 18, and I told him I'd been certain since I was 14 and first suspected that the scholarship account in my name had been emptied. That night, as I lay in bed, I reviewed every page of the plan again, every timestamp, every signature, every detail I had spent the last 2 years building while smiling at the people who thought I was just lucky to be supported. Elaine went to sleep in her guest room, locked the door, and left the lights on, which I noted without reacting, because scared people make mistakes, and I needed her to make at least one more. Elaine came into our lives when I was 12 and barely finished memorizing the route to the hospital where my mom spent her final nights, and just 13 months after her funeral, Dad brought home this woman who wore perfume to breakfast and heels on carpet. He introduced her as someone special, told me she made him feel alive again, and asked me to give her a chance, because we can't stay frozen in sadness forever, as if grief was something that expired on a schedule he could control. I nodded when she offered to help redecorate, carried her boxes up the stairs even though they smelled like something store-bought and foreign, and I smiled when she told me I was mature for my age, because that's what girls do when they're taught that silence is politeness. Elaine called me sweetheart in front of her friends, referred to me as our daughter at client dinners, and clapped the loudest at school awards, but she never once asked how I was sleeping, whether I missed my mother, or what it felt like to come home and find her wedding photo gone. She replaced everything slowly: the books, the art, the calendar, the smell of garlic that used to live in our kitchen, and every time I mentioned Mom's name, Elaine would just tilt her head like she was trying to remember someone from a different story. Dad followed her lead, started acting like she had saved him, like the dinners she cooked and the donations she coordinated were equal to the woman who raised me on hand-me-down cookbooks and late-night stories from her childhood. I was expected to adapt, to transition smoothly into this new phase of family, and when I questioned anything, like why Mom's vegetable garden became a meditation patio, or why her jewelry was suddenly misplaced, I was accused of holding on to pain that didn't help anyone. I performed like they needed me to perform, posed for their social media, memorized names of people who didn't care about mine, and said thank you every time Elaine bought me a dress that looked more like her style than mine. When I turned 15, she threw a birthday dinner at a resort and invited people I barely knew while telling her friends how proud she was of my girl, and I thanked her like I was reading a script someone else wrote. I kept my head down, studied harder than anyone else in my year, volunteered for extra credit projects, and maintained perfect attendance while recording everything I could about her schedule, her phone habits, her online orders, and the stories she repeated at every dinner. Dad barely noticed that I stopped laughing, that I spent more time in my room than I did with friends, or that I never brought anyone home unless I knew Elaine would be gone for the evening. He started taking business trips more often, and when I checked his calendar against hotel receipts using the family laptop he never bothered to log out of, I found names that didn't match his itinerary. Elaine complimented my manners to anyone who'd listen but didn't notice when I started locking my bedroom door or keeping a journal of everything she said about Mom that contradicted what I remembered. One night, while she was hosting a dinner party for someone from Company A, I overheard her telling a guest that she always knew she'd be a great mother, just hadn't had the opportunity before, and that's when I started saving every receipt she touched. By the time I turned 16, I had over 100 screenshots, 47 recorded conversations, 3 anonymous tips from someone at her office who didn't like the way she talked about my mother's family business, and an email chain between her and Dad that made it clear they'd been planning to push me out of the trust. Elaine used charm like a weapon, told Dad what he wanted to hear, and convinced him to adjust my college plans so I'd study overseas, a detail I only learned because I intercepted a letter from the firm's lawyer congratulating him on the new guardian clause. I didn't confront either of them because I had learned early that power didn't come from volume or confrontation. It came from knowing when to collect and when to strike. The only time I ever slipped was when I found out she'd donated all of Mom's remaining clothes to charity without telling me, and I asked her what gave her the right to erase someone who built this family from scratch. Elaine smiled like I was being dramatic, said the clothes were outdated, and asked if I'd rather keep a box of worn-out sweaters or make room for something fresh and healing. So I told her I'd rather keep the truth, and she laughed like that was cute. Dad sided with her, said I needed to grow past the symbolism, and that maybe it was time to stop defining myself by the woman I lost and start seeing what I had right in front of me. That night, I took the last sweater I had of Mom's from under my pillow, sealed it in a plastic case, and placed it behind the bookshelf where I kept my printouts, recordings, and timeline. I knew then that Elaine didn't just want to live in the house. She wanted to rewrite who lived here before her. The night Elaine made me skip my school play for her charity dinner was the night I stopped pretending I didn't know exactly who she was and what she was trying to erase from my life. I had been cast as the lead in the first production our school had done since the arts program was revived, something I had worked toward for 2 years, attending every audition, memorizing every line, and practicing until my voice cracked from repetition. When I told her the date conflicted with her event, she didn't look up from her phone before saying that I'd need to make the right choice, because the Richardsons would be there, and their son had just gotten into Ivy League School B, and connections like that didn't come often. Dad tried to speak up, asked if there was any way the gala could be missed or rescheduled, but Elaine placed her hand on his wrist, looked at him the way she always did when she wanted to remind him who kept his schedule full, and said, "It's just a school play." He nodded without looking at me, said, "There'll be others," and that's when something inside me stopped asking for permission to be angry. I went to my room, locked the door, pulled out the old wooden box that had sat untouched on the top shelf of my closet since Mom's funeral, and opened it for the first time since the day the lawyer gave it to me with a note that said she wanted me to have it when I was ready. Inside, under the small lock of my baby hair and the antique bracelet she used to wear, was a journal bound in soft leather with my name pressed into the corner, the only place in the house where my name hadn't been replaced or removed. The pages were filled with her handwriting, the kind that tilted slightly to the right and always ended each sentence like she was leaving space for something unsaid, but most of it was the kind of love you'd expect, memories, advice, hopes for a future she knew she wouldn't see. The last page, dated 2 weeks before she died, was the reason I didn't sleep that night because it began with the words, "If you're reading this, Samantha, then I didn't get the chance to tell you everything myself." She told me about a safe deposit box, gave me the location, the name of the bank, and said the key was taped inside the cover, which it was small and silver and colder than I expected when I held it in my hand. She said what I found there would change everything, and that she was sorry for putting this weight on my shoulders, but she didn't trust anyone else to carry it. I skipped school the next day for the first time in my life, walked into Bank C with my ID, the key, and a copy of the letter in case anyone questioned me, but the branch manager recognized my name immediately and said my mother had left very clear instructions. He took me to a private room, unlocked the box, and stepped outside while I looked inside and saw folders stacked neatly beside a USB drive and an envelope with my name on it in her handwriting again, except this time, the letters were slanted differently, rushed, like she hadn't known how much time she had left. The letter said she had discovered my father's affair with Elaine 6 months before her diagnosis, had hired a private investigator, and had been quietly gathering evidence while trying to decide whether she could survive long enough to do anything with it. She wrote that she didn't want to believe the worst until the investigator sent her photos of them together while she and I had been at a dentist appointment, proof that the nights Dad claimed to be working late had actually been nights spent at hotels with Elaine. She said the betrayal had been hard enough, but the financial records were what made her realize they weren't just in love. They were in partnership, moving money out of her family's trust, creating fake accounts, rerouting assets that were supposed to be mine when I turned 18. The USB drive contained hundreds of documents, bank records, credit card statements, property leases, shell agreements signed with initials I'd later matched to corporations no longer listed in any registry, but still traceable by transaction history. There were emails between my father and Elaine discussing next steps and reducing liabilities, and one message that ended with "Can't wait until this is finally behind us," sent 2 weeks before my mom's first unexplained collapse. She had included copies of her own medical records, pages she had collected from multiple doctors, toxicology tests, and handwritten logs of symptoms she started tracking after noticing they always followed meals Dad cooked for her, including details about dizziness, nausea, and eventual memory lapses. The last note said, "I can't prove anything in a court of law, but if something happens to me, I need you to protect yourself and what's yours." I sat there for nearly 2 hours reading everything twice, making notes, taking photos, and organizing the folders into 3 piles: financial theft, medical suspicion, and legal options. When I walked out of that bank, I knew I would never trust either of them again, and I also knew I would never confront them directly because people like that don't confess unless they have something bigger to lose. That night, I didn't speak during dinner, didn't ask how the event went, didn't respond when Elaine asked about my day, and when Dad mentioned a new client he was onboarding, I smiled for the first time in hours because I recognized the name. It was one of the shell companies in Mom's documents. I didn't tell anyone what I knew, not my teachers, not my friends, not even the school counselor, who once asked if I wanted to talk about the changes at home, because I understood early that silence gave me time, and time was the only thing Elaine hadn't tried to take from me yet. I made 3 copies of everything, one for the safe I installed behind my bookshelf, one I stored with a friend under the pretense of working on a scholarship portfolio, and one I uploaded into encrypted cloud storage that couldn't be accessed without a unique phrase hidden inside my debate notes. Over the next few months, I adjusted my schedule to monitor theirs more closely, started helping with errands so I could record conversations in the car, began setting reminders to photograph receipts Dad left on his desk, and installed a keystroke logger on the shared home computer without either of them noticing. Each time they left for a weekend retreat or corporate event, I stayed behind with college prep homework, which gave me full access to every drawer, file, and locked cabinet they didn't think I was curious enough to open. I joined the student investment club at school so I could learn the basics of what Dad did, then asked the faculty advisor if I could help organize guest speakers from the finance industry, choosing names that I later cross-checked against Mom's records for possible witnesses. When Elaine asked what I wanted for Christmas, I said a used laptop, claiming I needed it for coding tutorials, and then used it exclusively for building detailed spreadsheets tracking the diverted trust funds Mom had documented. By the time I turned 16, I had mapped the full structure of how Dad and Elaine moved money from Trust A into offshore entities, even matching timestamps from wire transfers to Elaine's travel records, proving she was in-country when every single shift occurred. I didn't confront them because that would have forced a reaction I couldn't control, and I didn't go to the authorities yet because I knew they'd try to bury it if I didn't already have a plan for what came next. Instead, I called the number Mom had left inside the final envelope. It rang twice before a man answered and said he had been waiting for my call since the day she passed, and when I told him I had everything ready, he said I wasn't the first miner he'd trained, but I might be the most focused. He gave me a time and address, told me not to bring anything electronic, and when I met him the following Saturday under the excuse of going to a study competition, he introduced me to the team my mother had arranged years earlier, a retired judge, a forensic accountant, and a lawyer who specialized in corporate theft and asset recovery. I laid out everything I had in front of them, watched as the judge scanned the spreadsheets and the lawyer flipped through the documents, and when they were done, they all said the same thing. It was enough to press charges, but if I wanted full control of the business, I'd have to outmaneuver them, not just expose them. I told them I didn't want revenge through humiliation because humiliation fades, but control reshapes everything, and I wanted every piece of it, not just what was left after the damage. The accountant said I'd need to learn everything: financial modeling, contract analysis, fraud detection, and I said I was ready, so they designed a private program for me under the pretense of academic enrichment. 3 evenings a week, I left the house saying I was volunteering at a youth center or attending prep classes, but in truth, I was sitting in front of old case files, studying legal precedents, and learning how to read internal reports the way auditors do before a collapse. The lawyer taught me how to write enforceable contracts, how to bury power clauses inside legalese, how to protect future assets with dual structures, and how to identify red flags in acquisition proposals before they could become liabilities. The judge introduced me to people who used to work with Mom, people who never liked Dad but stayed silent out of loyalty to her, and every one of them offered help once they knew I was serious about restoring the legacy she'd built. Meanwhile, at home, I kept playing my role, accepting praise from Elaine when she introduced me at her events, laughing at jokes I didn't find funny, wearing clothes she bought as part of her effort to present me as the perfect product of her parenting. When she threw me a party to celebrate an academic award I didn't care about, I smiled for the camera while calculating the timeline needed to initiate a silent shareholder transition once I turned 18. I found the original articles of incorporation buried inside a locked drawer in Dad's home office, and with help from the lawyer, I traced every amendment, noting which ones gave him control and which ones could be reversed under breach of fiduciary duty. I created a personal file called Operation R, short for Return, and inside it I logged every interaction they had with board member A, B, and C, ranking them by influence, financial exposure, and loyalty. Elaine continued to believe I was grateful, compliant, and eager to please, even when she caught me once with my mother's bracelet and asked if I was still dwelling on things best left in the past, to which I responded, "It helps me focus." Dad kept making the same mistake, underestimating me, assuming that his name alone would guarantee legacy, and ignoring the quiet pattern of control I was establishing behind every conversation he wasn't part of. At school, I was offered early admission to College D, and Elaine framed the acceptance letter before I even decided if I'd attend, announcing it to everyone like it proved her success as a mother, unaware that I had already made alternate plans that didn't involve giving her one more victory. By the time she said she wanted to adopt me legally, I had already drafted my response, because I knew exactly what she was trying to secure and how she planned to use it to tie herself permanently to the family trust. I agreed with a smile and told her it would be the best graduation gift I could ask for, while scheduling my next private meeting with the judge and updating my team on phase 2 of the plan. Elaine wanted the adoption papers signed before I left for college, said it would make everything feel official, complete, and secure, and when I asked if we could schedule a lunch to celebrate the decision, she offered to book a table at her favorite overpriced restaurant where every server already knew her by name. I told her I had something special to give her before the legal meeting, a private gift to mark the occasion, and she smiled like she thought it would be a necklace or maybe a handwritten note, something soft, something sweet, something she could show off at her next brunch. What she didn't realize was that her request for legal adoption triggered mandatory financial disclosures that would give me an updated asset snapshot, including the hidden accounts I had traced to her alias and the documents she assumed were buried under her fake consulting firm's paperwork. When we sat down to lunch 2 days before Mother's Day, I handed her an envelope containing a handwritten letter stating how much her guidance meant to me, carefully worded to appear grateful on the surface, but structured to read like a checklist of liabilities if she actually paid attention. She read the first paragraph and teared up, reaching for my hand, said she had waited years for this moment, that love didn't always begin at birth, but sometimes through effort and choice, and I told her I agreed completely. It was all about the choices we make when no one's watching. She didn't ask why I wanted her to open her real Mother's Day gift alone in her dressing room, didn't question why I wanted her to see it before the guests arrived for the garden party, because people like Elaine never expect the person they've underestimated to be the one holding the fuse. I spent the next day compiling the final version of the book, selecting each photo, printing every screenshot, reformatting each document, and layering it in chronological order from first betrayal to final transfer, so she would have no choice but to see the entire arc of her deception play out page by page. I titled the book A Daughter's Gratitude and wrapped it in silver foil with a ribbon she once told me was her favorite color, because I wanted her to understand this wasn't about cruelty, it was about accuracy. When the party started, I handed her the gift and insisted she open it in private, told her it was too personal to share in front of guests, and she nodded, saying she'd make time once the photos were done and the toast had been given. I told her it couldn't wait and that it would make her appreciate the day more, and for the first time in years, she hesitated, scanning my face for any sign of challenge or insubordination, but I kept my expression calm and steady and waited. She left for the dressing room with the box under her arm while I greeted guests, made small talk with Dad's colleagues, and answered every compliment about my poise, with a thank you rehearsed enough to sound automatic. When I checked on her 10 minutes later, she was still sitting on the edge of her bench with the book open on her lap, one hand gripping the cover and the other flipping slowly through the pages, and when she looked up at me, she didn't say anything at first, just blinked like someone trying to decide if they were awake. She asked what I wanted, said if this was blackmail, I had chosen the wrong moment, but I told her it wasn't blackmail because I wasn't asking for silence. I was offering an alternative to arrest, and that she had until 9 a.m. the next day to decide whether she wanted to meet with the legal team or wait for law enforcement. She said I couldn't possibly understand what I was threatening, that I was still just a teenager playing with legal terms I didn't fully grasp, and I replied that her assumption was exactly why this moment was possible. I told her that offshore account access had become traceable under new compliance laws, that cell tower data could be matched to transaction timestamps, and that I already had statements from 3 different regulators willing to review her activity if I submitted my evidence. She stood and called me ungrateful, said she had done nothing but provide for me, raise me, love me, and I said she had done nothing but replace my mother's face with her own, and then try to steal everything she left behind. I warned her that her reaction would determine how tomorrow went, and that the more emotional she became now, the more obvious her guilt would look when the official review began. She knocked over her glass, stormed into the bathroom, and when she came back out, her mascara was gone and her tone was lower, and she asked again what exactly I expected in return for keeping all of this to myself. I told her that she and Dad would resign from Company A, transfer operational control to me through the original trust mechanism, restore the stolen funds under supervision, and sign an agreement acknowledging their actions without legal contest. She said it was impossible, that the board would never accept a teenager as interim lead, and I told her that 3 board members had already signed letters of support 2 weeks ago when I shared the documents proving that Dad had forged expense authorizations without proper audits. I left her there and went to find Dad, handed him the second copy of the book, and asked him to read it before the guests left, told him I'd be in the kitchen when he finished, and that it was his last chance to respond like a man instead of a coward. He joined me 20 minutes later, silent, pale, holding the closed book in both hands like it might burn through his fingers, and when he spoke, all he said was, "She knows everything," and I nodded once, because that was all the confirmation I needed. He asked if I intended to press charges or just take over quietly, and I told him that depended entirely on how cooperative he planned to be and whether he wanted to end this with a signed agreement or a public scandal. He said my mother would be ashamed of me, and I said my mother planned every step of this before she died, and I was just the one who followed her map while he rewrote his memories. Dad agreed to the 9 a.m. meeting because he saw the timelines and realized that every action he thought was buried had already been cataloged, dated, annotated, and backed by people whose names still carried weight inside the industry he used to manipulate. He asked me if Elaine had seen the section about her offshore spending and the unfiled tax liabilities, and I told him she had read it 3 times before slamming the door to her room, and that based on her behavior, she understood it wasn't just a threat. I told him the meeting would not be a negotiation but a signing, that everything had been prepared by the legal team my mother assembled, and that the only discussion left was whether they wanted this transition to look like succession or exposure. He asked if I wanted an apology, and I said apologies were worthless when they arrived with legal disclaimers and selective memory, and that what I wanted was control, transparency, and permanent separation from everything they had touched with deception. Elaine didn't speak to me that night, and didn't come down for breakfast, but I checked the garage before we left and saw her car was still there, which told me she hadn't tried to flee, at least not yet, and I passed that information to the judge as we arrived at the office. Inside the meeting room, Dad reviewed every document twice, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't try to lawyer his way out of anything, just signed page after page as the retired judge guided him through the clauses about resignation, power of attorney transfer, voting restrictions, and asset return schedules. When he reached the page that barred him from contacting me directly until after I turned 18, he paused and said I was still his daughter and that he should be able to speak to me if he needed to, but I told him he forfeited that right when he ignored my mother's will and tried to redirect a future that didn't belong to him. He asked again if I really believed he had poisoned her, and I said I believed the evidence was enough to open an investigation and that his behavior since her diagnosis only strengthened the suspicions that had already existed in her final journal entries. The judge moved us forward, asked him to sign the media statement prepared in advance, the one that described the leadership transition as a family decision rooted in legacy protection and long-term planning, which he did without argument, knowing any resistance would trigger immediate legal filings and breach clauses. After the meeting ended, Dad left with the paralegal assigned to monitor his housing move and schedule controlled access to the family home, which would now be treated as a company asset until full property division could be finalized in alignment with the trust's ownership terms. I went home alone, changed clothes, checked every door and drawer to confirm nothing had been tampered with, then called Elaine's name twice before finding her in Mom's old garden chair, holding a photo she must have taken from the book without me noticing. She asked why I waited so long, why I let her believe things were normal if I had already built the case, and I told her I waited because I needed every step documented, every lie committed with confidence, every manipulation finished without excuse. She said she wanted to talk without lawyers, and I agreed for 10 minutes, on record, with full audio capture from my secondary device placed in plain view, which she didn't argue against because even she understood that her credibility was already gone. I told her the terms: full resignation, return of diverted funds, no contest on the trust, public statement of support for my leadership, and no future attempts to re-enter corporate decision-making or claim family status in financial disclosures. She said she would lose everything, that the lifestyle she built depended on the image we all helped her create, and I told her that was exactly the difference between inheritance and theft. One is earned, the other is temporary. She asked if I planned to press charges, and I told her the same thing I told Dad. The criminal filings were drafted and dated, and if either of them breached the exit terms, the files would be delivered to the appropriate agencies within 24 hours. She asked if she could have time to think, and I told her she had until the official board announcement the next morning, because after that, her signature would be irrelevant, and her name would be omitted from every future briefing. She didn't respond, just nodded once and went upstairs, and I spent the rest of the night sending final documents to the legal team, reviewing my prepared remarks for the press call, and confirming with the internal communications lead that all legacy staff would be informed by 10 a.m. The next morning, I walked into the building where I used to wait for Dad in the lobby after school and took the elevator to the top floor without anyone stopping me, because the system badge had already been transferred and the access code had already been reset. I entered the conference room and greeted the 3 board members who had stood by my mother when Dad tried to expand past his partner agreement, and reminded them that today wasn't just a correction, it was a restoration. When the public announcement went out, Elaine was already gone, having left a signed agreement on the kitchen counter and a message on the home line saying she would not contest anything, provided the press release didn't mention her role in any financial matters. Dad complied with the terms and submitted to the quarterly oversight schedule we established, which required full access to his communications, asset declarations, and financial behavior, with random audits scheduled without notice. Company A stabilized within 6 weeks, thanks to the emergency management team my mother had coordinated before her death, and clients who had been on the fence returned once they learned her daughter had taken the reins with her name still intact. I deferred college for 1 year to ensure the leadership transition held, then moved into a downtown apartment under the firm's executive development program, which allowed me to continue training with the same team that helped build the original infrastructure. Elaine reappeared in another city under a new job title and a reduced salary, her assets frozen under provisional agreements, and her passport flagged in connection with outstanding foreign transactions still under review by International Agency B. I never spoke to her again directly, but once a year, on Mother's Day, I sent her a package with a single photograph of my mother and a typed note that read, "Still watching." After the transition was finalized, I began my first executive review cycle by scheduling one-on-one sessions with every department lead, asking direct questions about project spending, partner alignment, and internal audits, while cross-checking their answers against the financial trail I had already reconstructed from Mom's private records. Several of them confessed they had questioned Dad's decisions over the past 2 years, but said nothing out of respect for his position and the belief that my mother had approved the expansions, unaware that she had been quietly shut out long before she became too sick to object. I asked them each if they would support a return to foundational values, transparency, and long-term sustainability, and every one of them agreed without hesitation once I showed them the signature audit trail proving how performance had been artificially inflated to mislead stakeholders. I appointed 3 of Mom's original allies to a restructured internal oversight board, assigning them responsibility for monitoring compliance, verifying contract legitimacy, and ensuring no future attempt to reroute company funds would go undetected or unpunished. The retired judge joined our weekly planning calls as an advisor under a consultancy agreement I signed personally, and the forensic accountant remained embedded in our finance team under a rotating clearance structure that gave him silent authority over all flagged transactions. I didn't allow Dad to return to the office until 2 full quarters had passed and only under strict observation, limiting him to internal advisory tasks unrelated to client interaction, branding, or strategic growth, because I wanted him to experience the same sidelining he had subjected my mother to. Elaine was forced to resign from the last remaining board she sat on when the financial disclosures became public record as part of our annual report, and although I didn't initiate the leak, I didn't intervene to stop it either when a journalist from publication B requested comment. When I finally sat down with my mother's former general counsel, she handed me a letter that had been held in escrow for 5 years, unopened until the company passed back under my control, and inside were 5 handwritten lines that read, "If you're reading this, then you didn't run. That means everything. I'm proud of you." I placed the letter in the locked drawer of my office desk, added 2 additional layers of biometric verification, and informed our digital systems administrator that any unauthorized attempt to access that drawer would result in immediate termination without review. In parallel with restructuring the executive team, I opened a private inquiry into my mother's final months, hiring 2 independent toxicologists and 1 retired medical examiner to reanalyze the food samples and cosmetic products I had preserved in vacuum-sealed containers inside our old attic. The first toxicologist returned inconclusive findings, noting unusual traces of substances that could have originated from multiple sources, but the second specialist flagged a consistent presence of a heavy metal compound found only in a specific type of imported herbal supplement that had been regularly shipped to our house under Dad's name. I confronted Dad in his quarterly review and asked him if he remembered ordering those supplements, and he said Elaine handled the household purchases and that he had no recollection of using that brand, which I noted in the official record, but did not challenge further. The retired medical examiner conducted a forensic timeline comparison and concluded that while there wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone with intent, there was sufficient irregularity to reopen my mother's medical file under cause of suspicious decline. I filed the request with the county health board under an alias and listed myself as the executor of the estate, then scheduled a private hearing to determine whether the matter could be referred to an investigative panel for formal consideration. Elaine's legal team sent a cease and desist letter requesting that I refrain from public accusations or statements implying guilt, and I responded by forwarding a copy of the medical inconsistencies to her current employer, along with a timeline of financial misconduct under her previous roles. She resigned the following day without notice, and a week later, I received an anonymous message from a blocked number that said, "You win, I won't fight anymore," which I printed, filed, and never acknowledged. Dad remained silent through the investigation, submitted every document requested, and appeared at each review meeting on time, emotionless and compliant, but he never once asked if I still believed he had contributed to Mom's decline intentionally. I returned to the cemetery for the first time since everything had been signed, stood over her headstone, and read the quarterly report out loud. Revenue stabilized, trust funds replenished, offshore accounts closed, personnel reviewed, compliance restored, and board confidence at an all-time high. When I told her I had followed every step she left me, I meant it without exaggeration, and when I said I would never let them rewrite her role in any version of this company's history, I meant that too. I left a single company access badge with her initials printed across the back on the grave, not as tribute but as closure, because she had built the foundation with full access and died with none, and that imbalance would never repeat under my watch. Elaine was arrested 3 weeks later after attempting to use an inactive debit card linked to one of the foreign accounts flagged in the compliance report, and although the charges were ultimately reduced in exchange for cooperation, the public record was clear and permanent. Dad did not attend the hearing, and I didn't expect him to, because I already knew he had chosen survival over accountability and believed silence would protect him as long as no one could prove he crossed the final line. He asked once more, months later, if I still believed he was guilty of more than financial betrayal, and I answered by showing him the food logs, toxicology inconsistencies, supplement receipts, and meal calendars, then asked what kind of man would ignore that pattern if he truly loved the person it described. He didn't answer, and I didn't need him to, because the absence of denial was louder than anything else he could have said. After Elaine's arrest, I held a closed executive session to review the damage to our partnerships, preemptively issued a compliance audit statement to every major client, and restructured our client relations protocols to remove any remaining contacts linked to her former associates. The audit confirmed that over 60% of Elaine's discretionary spending had been masked as consulting expenses, funneled through entities she either managed or influenced directly, and though most of the funds had been frozen or returned, the reputational fallout remained significant enough to warrant a public corrective strategy. I hired a communications advisor approved by the Internal Oversight Board, drafted a joint message that named no one but referenced decisions made outside the bounds of our values, and launched a 6-month rebranding effort focused on legacy, trust, and generational continuity under my leadership. When the statement went live, Dad sent me a one-line message asking if this was how I wanted our family name remembered, and I replied that he had made that choice the moment he prioritized his affair over transparency, his ambition over my mother, and his silence over my future. I didn't speak to him for the next 60 days, not out of anger but necessity, because everything that needed to be said was now legally documented, and personal emotion no longer had space in a structure built on accountability. The judge contacted me after the first quarter ended, informed me that the recovery fund Mom established in secret had grown faster than expected due to investment rollovers, and asked if I wanted to allocate a portion toward expansion or reinvest into education initiatives, as outlined in her final memo. I chose education because she had written once that knowledge without access was wasted legacy, and I created a scholarship fund in her name for students who had lost a parent and still intended to rebuild something meaningful from what remained. Each recipient received a personal letter signed by me, a short message explaining why this scholarship existed, and a reminder that grief wasn't an excuse to give up, but a reason to start planning. Elaine's cooperation with the authorities reduced her sentence to probation with asset forfeiture, but her name remained on the industry's internal watch lists, and the last I heard, she was working under an alias at a regional firm with no connection to our network. She attempted once to reach out through her attorney, offering to write a public letter of apology in exchange for a statement of forgiveness, but I declined without comment, because forgiveness isn't something you purchase to clean up a headline, it's something you earn, and she had never once acknowledged what she took. Dad stayed out of the media, declined interviews, and resumed teaching part-time at a small finance program where he no longer had access to company resources, staff influence, or client introductions, and I approved his employment terms with clear language restricting any use of our name in his resume or biography. He sent me a note after his first semester ended, said he hoped I was proud of what I built, that Mom would be too, and I filed the note without responding because pride meant nothing when it came after deception, and acknowledgement without restitution would never be enough. I expanded the forensic training division under our compliance team, hired 2 of the consultants who helped me reconstruct the offshore transfers, and placed them in charge of internal auditing and new employee screening, ensuring the next generation of managers would never be blindsided the way Mom had been. When the youngest board member resigned citing personal reasons, I nominated a candidate from outside our usual circles, a young woman who had once written an editorial criticizing Company A for its lack of transparency during Dad's tenure, and when the board questioned the nomination, I told them that credibility only matters when it's been earned through opposition. The vote passed by a single margin, and the day she joined, I handed her the same onboarding packet every executive receives, along with a handwritten message: accountability is not optional here. I kept my promise to Mom, not just in word but structure, rewriting every outdated policy that enabled silent corruption, embedding whistleblower protections into every hiring contract, and linking performance reviews to ethical behavior, not just profit. When I attended my deferred orientation at College D, I declined the full scholarship they offered, choosing instead to pay privately through the secondary trust Mom had established, because I didn't want them using my name for branding while forgetting the system that nearly erased it. I completed my coursework remotely, while continuing to lead Company A, splitting my time between academic deadlines and boardroom decisions, using every lesson I learned from dismantling Elaine and Dad's plans to build systems no one could game without leaving evidence. During one of my financial law seminars, a professor asked what motivated me to pursue this field so young, and I answered without hesitation: fraud isn't just numbers, it's betrayal measured in silence. He didn't press further, and I didn't offer details, because the story wasn't meant for applause, it was meant for survival, and survival didn't require explanation once the structure was stable. Elaine faded from relevance, and Dad faded into administrative routines, neither of them able to change the narrative now anchored by recorded history, signed agreements, and a leadership model I had shaped with intention, precision, and irreversible control. The company held its annual conference with a keynote I delivered personally, summarizing our transformation not through inspiration but systems. Audits, ratios, protocols, verified outcomes, the language of people who understood legacy isn't an idea, it's an infrastructure. At the end of my speech, I quoted one line from my mother's first public address when she launched the company 30 years ago. "A name is not a right, it's a responsibility." I didn't mention Dad or Elaine once. 2 months after the annual conference, I received a subpoena requesting materials related to the original trust transfers executed under Dad's authority during the period before Mom's diagnosis. And while I had already archived everything for internal compliance, this request came directly from Federal Unit C. I contacted the judge immediately, forwarded the documents with a breakdown of each signature, approval timestamp, and corresponding internal memos, and within 48 hours, he confirmed the investigation had moved beyond corporate fraud into potential premeditation tied to caregiver misconduct. I called Dad and informed him that his name had been flagged under suspicious activity, that agents would be reviewing meal records, travel patterns, and private health care expenses, and that any attempt to alter those records would constitute obstruction, punishable under the revised enforcement guidelines passed last quarter. He didn't deny it, didn't yell, didn't ask why I was doing this. He just asked if I believed he had poisoned her, and I told him the investigation wasn't about belief anymore. It was about patterns that only he and Elaine had access to during the exact time frame Mom's symptoms accelerated. I forwarded the same forensic summary the toxicologist had sent me months earlier, along with 3 highlighted sections from Mom's private health journal, each detailing episodes that followed meals cooked by Dad and supplemented by vitamins only he handled. He sent a message the next day asking to meet privately, unrecorded, off the record, just one conversation between a father and daughter, and I declined, responding that conversations without documentation were what got us here in the first place. Elaine's probation officer called 2 days later, said she'd attempted to contact a former pharmaceutical supplier tied to one of the compounds found in the toxicology report, and although the attempt was unsuccessful, it violated her cooperation agreement and triggered an immediate asset recheck. I submitted a secondary affidavit outlining all instances of concealed medical history during Mom's last 3 months, including Dad's refusal to get a second opinion when the symptoms shifted from neurological to systemic, which Mom noted in her final letters as the moment she realized no one else was going to intervene. The judge approved a temporary freeze on all accounts under Dad's sole name, pending formal inquiry results, and I issued an internal statement to the executive team clarifying that no member of my family currently held financial or legal influence over Company A. When the financial news cycle picked up the story, headlines speculated about the reopening of an old wrongful death case, and while I gave no interviews, I issued a written statement confirming full cooperation and reiterating our company's position on legacy accountability. Dad sent one more letter through his attorney, requesting a private meeting to explain his version of events, and I had it read aloud in the boardroom to ensure nothing in it was misinterpreted. It included a timeline of excuses, a vague reference to memory gaps, and a plea to preserve what was left of our relationship. I instructed legal to respond with an offer. If he submitted a sworn affidavit detailing Elaine's activities, every conversation he remembered, and each transaction she initiated under his name, I would request leniency in the form of supervised probation rather than formal indictment. He signed the affidavit 2 days later, 26 pages, typed and notarized, and on page 19, he admitted that he had ignored signs, that he had delegated everything because it was easier than confronting the truth, and that by the time he realized Mom might be right, it was too late to undo what had already begun. That line, "I chose silence over confrontation," became the justification for my final move, revoking his consulting access, dissolving his residual shares under breach of ethical conduct, and reallocating them into a memorial endowment under Mom's name for early cancer detection research. When I announced the new fund at our mid-year briefing, I listed every woman who had worked behind the scenes to protect the company, from legal, finance, operations, compliance, and read aloud Mom's original business charter stating that power must always be held accountable, regardless of last names or titles. Elaine's assets were liquidated under court supervision, and her name was permanently disqualified from registering any business entity under Regulatory Zone D, closing the last possible door she could use to reclaim influence or rebuild elsewhere. Her attorney contacted me once more, said she was considering leaving the country under a legal name change, and I responded that the moment she did, I would trigger the sealed file we'd prepared with Agency F, containing evidence from her international transfers, which she had never formally disclosed. She stayed. Dad relocated to a small town under a different jurisdiction, out of public view, removed from his former network, and while I allowed the transfer without resistance, I notified the appropriate authorities that all future movement would be monitored and must remain reportable under the conditions of his signed cooperation deal. When I finalized the year-end report, I included a quiet line under leadership acknowledgments. For those who built foundations others tried to bury, you were never erased. I returned to the bank where I first opened Mom's safe deposit box and requested to close it officially, having moved every document, record, and item into the company's archival vault, protected under 7-point biometric authentication and legal seal until succession. The branch manager asked if I wanted to leave anything behind, perhaps a token or note, and I handed him a single page from the original journal, the line that started everything. If you're reading this, Samantha, it means you were brave enough not to run. I requested no forwarding, no signature, and no follow-up, because the story no longer belonged in that box. It belonged in the structure I rebuilt, the system I protected, and the future I defined without needing anyone's permission. I never saw Elaine again, never spoke to Dad beyond required disclosures, never responded to the occasional third-party attempt to reconnect, because when a line is drawn and a legacy defended, what's left behind is no longer family, it's evidence. The final step in the transition wasn't about contracts or control, but ensuring that every lie told during the years of manipulation could no longer be repeated under a new name, buried in a new deal, or excused by legacy titles that no longer meant anything without truth behind them. I met with the External Compliance Committee and submitted a voluntary audit proposal to have Company A reviewed every fiscal year by a third-party firm with full access to internal documentation, including executive communication, asset transfers, and bonus structures, because I knew that real trust didn't come from intention, it came from proof. The board passed the motion unanimously after I laid out the long-term savings achieved by rebuilding ethically rather than hiding losses, and when one director asked if I thought we could have prevented this years ago, I told him that prevention requires both knowledge and courage, and for a long time, too many people had neither. I reassigned every executive who had signed off on blind authorizations under Dad's leadership to advisory roles without voting power, gave them the option to exit with severance or remain under full accountability review, and not one of them argued, which told me they understood exactly how close they had come to losing everything. I brought in a new operations lead who had previously blown the whistle on a separate scandal at Firm F, and when the media questioned her history, I told them openly that integrity looks like defiance before it looks like leadership, and that's the quality I was hiring for. I restructured our philanthropic arm to include community oversight, shifted 10% of executive bonuses into reinvestment pools tied to measurable impact, and rewrote our employee handbook with language that explicitly protected dissent as a form of contribution, not a threat to unity. I declined 3 speaking invitations from leadership summits that wanted to celebrate my rise as the youngest female CEO in the industry, because I wasn't interested in being a symbol, I was interested in being a safeguard. The internal newsletter I sent out at the beginning of Q3 contained one sentence from Mom's original planning binder: "Reputation without structure is decoration." When the health board concluded their investigation into Mom's medical records, the results came back as non-conclusive with irregularities, a phrase I had anticipated and prepared for, and though they would not pursue a criminal case without further evidence, the report was enough to keep Elaine flagged indefinitely under risk assessment. I filed the report in the compliance archive, attached a personal addendum stating that non-conclusive does not mean false, it means unfinished, and then directed our internal review team to update our due diligence training with a case study titled, "The Risk of Selective Silence." I visited the house I grew up in one final time, walked through each room noting which parts still held trace value and which ones had already been replaced, and then signed the sale documents and donated the proceeds to the fund we had established in Mom's name. Dad's signature was required on the final property release, and he signed it without delay or comment, submitting it through his lawyer along with a brief note that said, "This house never belonged to us the way it did to her." I didn't reply, and I didn't need to, because acknowledgement without repair was still a form of escape, and escape was no longer available to either of them now that everything had been recorded, archived, and secured under systems built with more precision than they ever imagined I would be capable of. Elaine attempted one last legal maneuver to reclaim partial access to a consulting portfolio she had helped develop early in her relationship with Dad, arguing that her input had shaped strategy, even if her methods were flawed, and I responded with a counterclaim citing misrepresentation, contract fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty, which ended the discussion permanently. At our next all-hands meeting, I gave my closing remarks by listing 5 names, not executives, not board members, but entry-level staff who had submitted anonymous concerns about irregularities over the years and were ignored by those in charge, and I promoted all 5 of them to internal leadership development roles. I said clearly, loyalty is not obedience, and I made sure the video replay was accessible on every internal platform with no edits and full transcript for transparency. The press followed the story for another month, asked if I would ever write a book, sell the movie rights, or build a personal brand around survival, and I declined every offer, stating that survival is not entertainment and justice is not a story arc. It's a system that either works or fails, and mine had to work. I ended the fiscal year by sending one final package to Elaine with no return address, containing only a single photograph, Mom in her garden, untouched, smiling, alive, and one sentence typed on a plain white card. "You didn't erase her." She never responded. Dad sent me a holiday card with no message inside, just a photo of a mountain and his signature, and I filed it under the same category as every document I had scanned and stored, processed, referenced, and closed. 2 weeks later, I stood in the main conference room with the executive team and began outlining our 5-year plan, not as an act of celebration but continuation, because the legacy wasn't just saved, it was now mine to carry forward. Everything they tried to hide had been brought into the light. Everything they thought I couldn't understand, I had already mastered. Everything they built on stolen ground, I had rebuilt from foundation to skyline. I didn't finish this for closure because closure implies something has ended, and this isn't about endings, it's about control, succession, and knowing that the structure my mother built was never meant to be sentimental, fragile, or symbolic, but functional, resilient, and ultimately incorruptible under my watch. Every signature I forced them to write was a reversal of damage they thought I was too young to notice. Every document I unearthed was a reminder that memory leaves records, and every meeting I called was a reconstruction of the truth they spent years trying to bury under fake titles and forged loyalty. I didn't win because I exposed them. I won because I stayed, learned, waited, documented, and refused to give them the reaction they were prepared for, and instead gave them consequences they couldn't sidestep, negotiate, or buy their way around. The legacy they thought they stole was never theirs to keep, and by the time they realized the difference between owning and inheriting, I had already made sure that nothing with their names on it could operate without oversight, reversal clauses, or my signature. Dad still sends annual messages with no return expectation. Elaine hasn't tried to contact me since the last warning, and Company A operates under a policy where no one holds unchecked power, including me, because revenge that ends in corruption is just another version of their mistake. I tell people I run a business, but what I really run is a system that defends the people it serves, anticipates the kind of betrayal I lived through, and makes sure no 16-year-old ever has to learn audit trail analysis just to keep what their mother left them. Some people inherit companies, others build them, but I reclaimed one from 2 people who believed that silence and manipulation could last longer than truth. They were wrong.